review of the risk principle, certain factors are tied to criminal behavior. I keep saying that over and over again. I can't say that enough. Don't forget those top 8. Understanding the link between these top 8 and criminal behavior will help you understand the second aspect of the risk principle, and that is, the second aspect of the risk principle is, now I know what the risk is, how do I fix it? How do I improve it? How do I match it? What we should target, who we should target, and the needs principle about what we should target. By assessing and targeting a juvenile's criminogenic needs, those 8, we can reduce the likelihood of recidivism. We can reduce the likelihood of their continuing law-breaking behavior. Interventions must focus and target those needs. There is, and again, I'll kind of say this out loud in terms of, I'll do a precursor apology to any program that may be using any of these kinds of examples. But one of the things that you didn't see in the top 8, okay, you didn't see self-esteem, and I use this as a good example. Is self-esteem important? Absolutely. But there is no evidence out there to suggest that self-esteem programs lower recidivism. Now, it may be important for youth to have self-esteem, but keep in mind that you may be improving their overall general well-being, but you're not necessarily improving their probability of recidivism. That's just an example. And a kind of funny example around that is to say, when you focus only on self-esteem, what you get are criminals who feel good about themselves. So be careful about the practice to make sure it's in fact somehow, some way targeting those 8 principles. We talked in the last session about this idea about responsivity. How should we do it? That goes back to the example of, we've got to keep in mind that there are certain barriers that our youth have. And if we ignore those barriers, we're not helping the situation. Those barriers could be educational barriers, they could be transportation barriers, they could be cultural barriers. If we're not sensitive to the barriers, we are unable to appropriately target what they need. So this whole idea behind risk, need, and responsivity says those are the 3 keys for targeting appropriate interventions. The responsivity, there's internal factors in terms of responsivity. You see these up here: motivation, personality characteristics, cognitive deficits, and demographics. These are all those kind of internal things to be cognizant of. But there are also external things, as I already mentioned. Counselor characteristics. I said this in the last session, and I'll say it again. You have no idea how important, well, you probably do. Let me rephrase that. I can't emphasize enough how important your staff are. And the better your staff are, the better your program will be. And the bad news about that is, in tough economic times, when we have low unemployment rates, we sometimes settle for people in our programs, settle for staff. Oh, I know that, I know Robin's not very good at that, but, I can't get anybody else to apply. We just don't pay enough. And we settle for less than competent staff. And again, I know I'm talking about ideal, because again, I can't tell you how many people I hired, how much turnover I had in Omaha. Can't tell you how many people. But when we settle, we're actually hurting the kids. We're actually hurting the exact reason we're trying, or we're in the business. We have to have staff, and that includes counselors. I can't tell you how many times I've been faced with, they go to so-and-so because they're cheaper. You don't hear them say they went to so-and-so because they're better. They went to so-and-so because they're cheaper. If you want to be successful, don't settle. That's the bottom line. That's the takeaway. There's so much evidence out there, so much research out there that says the competency of your staff, the competency of your providers is directly correlated to the success of your program. Type of treatment. I mentioned that earlier about don't do cookie cutter kinds of programs. Support network. That has to do with, are you in fact creating an environment that once you're done with the youth, they'll be able to be supported in the future. There's some programs that do a great job about engaging family members in the diversion program. So they know what the youth is going to go through, and they can support the youth afterwards. Here's the expectations. Here's what we're doing. Mom and Dad, here's what we'd like you to do when they're not here. Ideal is culturally specific. I heard that somebody here doing some culturally specific kind of programs. Who was that, Monica? All right, congratulations to you. That's ideal. Can we always do that? No. If you can, that increases your probability. Good for you. And gender specific when you can. That's another ideal. What screening and assessment is not? You never, ever, ever want to take away professional judgment. Even though we talk about if you have a validated instrument, you've got to trust your instrument. You've got to be careful about overriding instruments. You still do not want to take away professional judgment because, and I'll give you another good example. There's not one single instrument out there, to my knowledge, that can assess everything. As an example, the YLS is weak on mental health. The YLS is weak on sexual offending. You may have to have a complementary instrument, if possible. You have to know your assessment instrument's strengths and weaknesses as well. There's no perfect instrument. With general caseloads, you should see an override that no more than 10% of the time. Overrides will increase if you have specialized caseloads, like I just said, sex offenders or severe mental health. And consider other complementary instruments whenever possible. Those are just, again, ideals. But professional judgment, there is something to say for gut level. There is. You know, if you've got skilled, trained staff, they do know. Don't disregard that. Have space for overrides. Just don't have it the exception and not the rule. Assess for intervention. In other words, this is what intervention should look like. Intervening in attitudes, peers, substance abuse, lack of empathy, lack of problem solving, lack of self-control. If you have programs that look like any of those, you're on the right track. If you have programs that look like any of these, you're probably not reducing recidivism. You're probably not reducing recidivism. For a very long time, we did this. Remember that shock, we'll do, what was it called? Shock? Scared straight. Take them into the prisons and we'll scare them. There isn't a bit of evidence out there that says that reduces recidivism. And in fact, there's some early evidence that's saying that's increasing recidivism. Scared straight programs. You don't buy that one. That's okay. I can just tell you, like I said, what the evidence is saying, that there's not a lot of evidence out there that's suggesting that's reducing. Does it have any value whatsoever? Possibly. Is it reducing the potential for recidivism?
I'm not saying I disagree 100% with what you're saying, but I think there's a way it can be done.
And do you want to talk about that? How can it be done?
Well, I think what worked for our program is we had to jail and come back and discuss it and talk about where things were going, and they were screened in before we met.
That doesn't sound like a scared straight to me, though. That sounds to me more like, we want to expose you.
Ours was more of an educational program, but it stopped.
But because here's the difference, okay? And I kind of want to talk about the difference. Because what I hear you say, and I'm not positive, because you just said a little, there's a lot to be said for contingency management programs. You know what contingency management programs look like? Contingency management programs look like, if you do X, Y is going to happen. Okay? And then when they do X, you got to do Y. So in other words, if you come up with a positive drug test, you're going to get 25 hours of community service. Okay? And then when they come up with the positive drug test, you do 25 hours of community service. That sounds like a contingency management program, because you're saying, if you do this, this is what you're going to get. I want you to see this. It's not this scared straight kind of approach, which is different, but saying, like I said, the difference between that intrinsic, here's what's going to happen to you, to, you know what? Make a choice. You can choose this, or let's talk about it. What else could your choices be? That kind of strategy could very well work.
Requirements, and so that could jeopardize federal funding for the state. So that's probably why you also hear that from the Plan Commission. A little bit is that because of the research behind that, OJJ is ruled that those programs are not allowed or in violation of some of those rules.
Because one of the things that I'm going to go back to a slide ahead in the last presentation that talked about, for lower risk juveniles, exposing them to what is available in the community. Now, if this is an educational, I'm exposing you to what's in the community, again, I go back to, that's much different than a scared straight approach. And so you want to be clear about your intent.
Deb, can you give
Yes.
me an example of the understanding one's culture and the programs that are out there?
What this has to do with is that, I'll give you an example and not necessarily a program, I'll give you, in certain cultures, women are subservient, okay? So if my program is designed about, I know why you hit her, because in your culture, women are subservient. That kind of approach is saying, that cultural awareness in that arena doesn't show recidivism, doesn't show any reduction in recidivism. That's an example of cultural, understanding one's culture. It's like excusing the behavior by understanding your culture. That's what they're saying. That make sense?
Sure.
If anybody, I see a couple of people like,
Just one of the programs that we're using is modeled after the Challenger tent, where teaching African American males the history of African American males in this country and making some, and it's been a pretty positive program.
Okay, remember, I also just want to be clear, though. I'm not saying that there isn't value. I'm just saying understand difference between, that may be fabulous that they have that knowledge, but if you had to say, you know what, I have to choose between two programs because I'm running out of money. This one reduces recidivism, and this one gives them information. Which do I choose? This is what this is saying, is choose programs that you know reduce recidivism. Not saying that that doesn't have value.
And absolutely, and you have to look at, they're in this educational setting, and this is kind of the focus of the class, but it is hitting upon antisocial peers, and it is hitting upon antisocial attitudes.
There's a whole session too on the difference between cognitive-based programs and educational programs. And I would venture to guess some of the things that you guys are describing too may fit more into the cognitive-based versus just pure education. And when you understand the difference between those two, cognitive-based programs are very effective. Educational-based programs are effective for low-risk offenders.